Once we've created this information ecosystem with reliable, fecund sources that has a nice breadth of scope and has a diversity of media and so on, we might think, well, we're done then. But we're really not. And there are two important things that we have to do continuously. One of them is maintain and refine our ecosystem, and the other is to use it. Use it not just when we absolutely need it, but to continue to inform and educate ourselves throughout our lives. So when we think about evaluating, maintaining, refining our information ecosystem, the general process that I encourage you to engage in is to go through and look at the individual properties of your ecosystem. Ask yourself, do I have accurate sources? Are they both reliable and sources that I have reason to believe have integrity? Are they fecund? Do I have a sufficient number of fecund sources across a sufficient number of topics? So do I have good scope? What about my slant? Have I let myself fall into a slant that's exclusively determined by my worldview? Or do I have at least some balance in the form of alternative perspectives, international perspectives, or perspectives from different orientations within my own ideology and so on? Finally, do I have that diversity of media where I'm reading books and I'm reading magazines and I'm reading newspapers, or I'm watching TV, but I'm also listening to podcasts and so on? Now you might think, oh, that sounds overwhelming. How could I possibly accomplish all of that? How can I do it? And so I'm going to give you sort of three kind of general suggestions for how you might go about maintaining and refining your ecosystem. So one strategy is to look at the history of the performance of your information ecosystem. Ask yourself, is it really performing in the way that you want? And one way to do this is the sort of edit on the fly approach. So if a news source disappoints you, you might consider looking for an alternative right then, or you might consider getting rid of it entirely. If you find that there's something that you have no sources about at all, you want to add a source to it. And so you might want to do this as you're going through your everyday information seeking and fact-checking life. Of course, sometimes you don't have time to do that, and so edit on the fly does require that you have a certain luxury and time. Another strategy, sort of the yearly doctor's appointment strategy, right? And end of the year review. So conveniently, at the end of every calendar year, oftentimes news organizations will go through a year in review, and they'll talk about significant things that happen, significant medical findings or scientific breakthroughs, or how the economy went and so on. And if you watch this and you're thinking to yourself, oh yeah, I saw that, or I remember that, and I had a really good story that I read about that, then chances are you're doing pretty good. But if you find yourself thinking, yeah, I didn't find out about that particular event until way after it happened, or I never even heard about that, or the story I got was quite different. And so you then might want to go through and think about, well, how do I want to change my information ecosystem so that the next time I see this year in review, I'll feel like, yeah, I was aware of these things. Yeah, I had fecund sources on these topics. Yeah, I knew all about it. Another strategy that you might employ is just sort of outside random sources. I oftentimes learn things from talking to my students or people that I meet. I've met a number of people, international people, traveling this summer, and I've learned all sorts of interesting things from them about their own countries and about Europe and about all sorts of other things. And so just going out and doing a Google search on a topic and looking and seeing what comes up and comparing it to the sources that you have, that too can work as a way of thinking about whether or not you've got a good source or a bad source. And of course, if you run across an article randomly, a professor assigns it, or a friend recommends it, or you see something on the news, you might think to yourself, well, maybe I ought to consider including that source in. Maybe I should look at other things that they wrote or other things that they produced, and so on. A final strategy that I would suggest would be to consult meta sources, media watchdogs. So find out what people who watch the media, who study journalism, who think it's important that we have these robust and vibrant information ecosystems, what do they have on their mind? So the idea that we've had this shrinking number of primary news sources and that they've been developing in news coverage all these news holes, areas where there really isn't any coverage at all, whereas there are news surpluses, areas where there are tons and tons of coverage. I discovered that by reading a Pew State of the Media report one year. And going to a media watchdog source, some have more or less agenda-driven analyses. The Pew Center for Journalistic Integrity, pretty good source to go to for a sort of nonpartisan and thoughtful evaluation of the state of the media in a given year, right? But all of these sources can help you to refine your information ecosystem, to identify weaknesses or blind spots, to determine what you might want to add or delete as you go on. And of course, reflecting on your worldview. Do you believe the same things that you believed when you were originally using your information ecosystem? So oftentimes when people go to college, one of the things that they do is they change a lot of their beliefs about the nature of the world. And so I stopped believing in a monotheistic Judeo-Christian deity, I think, pretty early on in my college career. People sometimes change their political orientations, or they come to have a different perspective on history and so on. And so as your worldview evolves, you'll want to think about that. Both think about things that might complement your worldview or help you to further develop it, elaborate it, fact check it, right? But also things that would confront it and expose you to alternative perspectives. These too are important. So if you like pictures, here's a picture that kind of depicts this idea of a constantly changing information ecosystem where you're pulling information in, but you're also going back and looking at those sources, refining the way that you think about and use your information ecosystem. And we can kind of think of the life cycle of an information ecosystem too. So our ecosystems are created or inherited to some degree, but once that happens, then we have to utilize those information ecosystems. We have to actively engage with the world, learn things, fact check, seek out information. And in doing that, we'll also want to start refining our information ecosystem to better reflect our needs, to get us at sources that better inform us, either through fecundity or accuracy, to increase our scope, and so on. And of course, once we refine them, we want to utilize those sources. So it's a continuing progression where we are constantly utilizing and updating our information ecosystem for the rest of our lives.